We have continuing coverage of the breaking news from Helsinki, Finland, where President Trump and President Putin are holding a historic summit. Joining us now is Ian Bremmer, Eurasia Group president and CBS News senior global affairs contributor. He has new information about what happened in the lead up to the summit. Good morning again, Ian. The lead up being the president was with NATO leaders. What happened at that meeting? We saw the rumbles. What was going on behind the scenes?
A few things. One is that emergency session where they asked the Georgian and Ukrainian presidents to leave in the middle of their presentation. Apparently Trump's like, okay, we're done with you now. One thing they did is Trump was very frustrated that he wasn't getting commitments from other leaders to spend more. And many of them said, well, we have to ask our parliaments. We have a process. We can't just tell you we're going to spend more. It's a legal process. Trump turns around to the Turkish president, Recep Erdogan, and says, except for Erdogan over here, he does things the right way, and then actually fist bumps the Turkish president. So if you want to talk about to what extent the allies are comfortable with Trump as opposed to the strongman leader, what we saw in the G20 with that second meeting, what we see now with NATO and the Putin meeting, this is a very visible suggestion of that.
Remind people why Europeans would be nervous for the American president to be heralding the Turkish leader who has no real domestic opposition.
Of course. I mean, after his executive presidency, the purges that have gone on internally, I mean, Turkey is hardly a liberal democracy at this point. Another thing that was interesting is that apparently the Dutch Prime Minister, Mark Rutte, was the last person to intervene at the summit before Trump had his press conference that was so extraordinary. He basically said, look, you're really frustrated. Why don't you just take a victory lap? Say that the allies have been spending $33 billion more since you became president. Take credit for it. That was the last thing Trump heard before he left the meeting. And it's the first thing he said.
Which would make a fist bump really unattractive and disturbing to people, the universal sign of way to go, good job. But what do you make of the comments that the two men made, President Putin and President Trump, before they sat down together? What do you make of their comments?
Well, I mean, I think interesting that Trump specifically talked about China. Talked about China a fair bit, more than any other thing he mentioned.
Did not mention Russian meddling in that.
Did not mention Russian. Promised he will talk about it. It's the one thing that he didn't say. Later on, he'll say, well, of course, I'm about to go into the meeting. He's sitting right there. I want to do that privately. But obviously, it's interesting. But, there are many people that do believe that long term, the United States and Russia should have a good relationship. China's the problem. China's the emerging superpower. China is actually the true competitor, undermining the Americans and also undermining the Russians long term. And I think that was Steve Bannon's view when he was the chief strategist for the White House. I think it's interesting that Trump's clearly turning against Beijing, the $200 billion announced in tariffs that may be coming down, the unhelpfulness more recently on North Korea from his perspective. I think he'd love to sense if he can move Putin on that. The other big thing he said was denuclearization.
We're going to have to leave it there, though. Even though you have one more big thing, we got to go. Thank you very much, Ian. Always good to have you at the table.